that very generous introduction, and I'm very honoured to be here at the great Warburg Institute. I have to say, last time I was here, my colleague Antonia Bostrom had told me about Elizabeth David's collection of cookbooks. And so I was up on the fourth floor trying to locate Huguenot recipes, because many of the vessels that we'll be looking at this evening were specifically designed to contain the latest French style in cuisine. So I'm sorry that I can't offer a tasting after this particular talk, but we are planning to offer a short course on Huguenot silver at the V&A in May and June next year, which coincides with a special exhibition on food. And so at least the very last session of that course will involve, I think, a Huguenot feast. So if I'm whetting your appetite, you're going to have to keep nurturing the idea in order to take advantage of that offer. Well, I'm sure many of you will know that the first Huguenot church in this great metropolis was established in 1550 in the heart of the City of London in Threadneedle Street. And by the late 16th century, Huguenot artists, designers and craftsmen were well established in this great city. I'm going to focus on the period of greatest Huguenot refuge this evening, from the early 1680s, when the persecution of the Protestants in France resulted, as we've heard, in the revocation of the edict signed at Nantes by Henri IV in 1598, which was revoked at Fontainebleau by Louis XIV in October 1685. And it's recently been demonstrated by Robin Gwynne, leading scholar of the Huguenot refuge, that contrary to earlier opinion, the British Isles became the most popular place of Huguenot refuge during that period, over and above the Low Countries. I believe that part of the reason for this must be that the French Protestants who settled in this country were joining well-established communities founded by French émigrés 2, 3 or 4 generations earlier, who were willing to welcome, accept and accommodate the new arrivals. These communities had both the traditions and the financial resources to facilitate the establishment of new Huguenot businesses and craft practices and charities to support those unable to earn a living. And all of this built on those institutions already well established. I would also like to pay a particular welcome to my colleague Olivia Horsfield-Turner. I'm delighted that she's able to be with us this evening. I don't know if you want to show yourself, Olivia. Yeah? Because Olivia is working on this very exciting research project, the James Lemon Research Project, part of BARI, the V&A Research Institute, which obviously focuses and demonstrates the importance of the Huguenot contribution to the burgeoning silk industry, established by Huguenot immigrants in Canterbury to begin with, famously in London's Spitalfields, and then on out to Sudbury and Macclesfield, for example, perhaps other places as well. And I'm also delighted that Liz Randall, the editor of Huguenot Journal, the Journal of the Huguenot Society, is with us this evening, sitting in the second row. So particular welcome to my partners in crime, if I may call you that. I'm sorry that David Mitchell is unable to be with us. He's been subjected to flu. But he has just published an amazing compendium on silversmiths in Elizabethan and Stuart London, with the support of the Goldsmiths Company, drawing on the records of the great livery company. And his extraordinary, groundbreaking volume illustrates and documents the work of several first-generation Huguenot goldsmiths of that period, including Noah Gilpar, a stranger goldsmith from Mons. And you'll note that many of the craftsmen I'm going to focus on actually come from regional centres in France, not exclusively, but many of them. Noah was sworn to the Goldsmiths Company in 1566, just 16 years after the Threadneedle Street Church had been established. And by 1568, he was an independent goldsmith in St Vidas parish, the parish in which the Goldsmiths Company is situated, and recorded as a member of that original French church. A denizen in 1579, he was still a member of the French church 20 years later, in March 1600, when he witnessed and stood godfather at a baptism there. In July 1606, his widow was also witness at a baptism at the French church. According to the Latin inscription on the inside of the bowl of this elegant wine cup, it was given to one Maria Corbett on the occasion of her baptism in 1587. It was acquired by the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, so it's part of their collection, interestingly, from the celebrated collection of Lord Swathling, sold at Christie's on the 6th of May 1924. And we're honoured to have Jennifer Montague with us this evening, who's also a descendant of Lord Swathling. But moving on in time, I show you this very sophisticated lantern clock by David Bouquet, a clock and watchmaker admitted to the Blacksmiths Company before the newly formed Clockmakers Company, formed in 1632. Clock and watchmakers would have belonged to the Blacksmiths Company. They were keen to attract foreign members for their skill, particularly as casemakers. We know that Bouquet was living outside the City of London walls at a Mr. Sampson's house in Blackfriars. He had 2 apprentices by 1622. He later served as an ancien, an elder of the French church in Threadneedle Street, for periods of 3 years, 4 times between 1637 and 1662, so is very much a backbone of that community. Of his 3 sons, 2, David and Solomon, became watchmakers, and Hector was apprenticed to Isaac Mebert or Maubert, a diamond cutter. Bouquet's clocks and watches are distinguished by their fine cases. And I don't have a slide of this, but one watch at the British Museum consists of a gold box enamelled in black and overlaid with floral decoration in realistic colours. On the inside, the dial is also enamelled with a painted landscape. And on the cover, there's an impressive array of 92 foil-set diamonds. Obviously, his connections with Huguenot diamond cutters stood him in good stead. And here on the screen is a silver case bracket clock, an equivalent luxury product to the exquisite watch that I just described. Within David Bouquet's reign, as it were, at the Huguenot church, a marriage between one Elizabeth Maubert, presumably connected with the diamond cutter, and Isa Pantin at the same church in 1658, and Pantin's then second marriage to Marie Bouquet, widow of Isaac Maubert, suggests that the Bouquet, Maubert, and Pantin families were closely interconnected. The leading goldsmith, Simon Pantin, son of Simon Pantin and Jeanne Maubert, was freed by apprenticeship to Pierre Harache by 1701, became a livery member of the Goldsmiths Company in 1712, and he took his son Simon as apprentice in 1717. His grandson, also Louis Pantin, became a clock case maker, and there's a signed example of his late 18th century work in the Palace Museum in Beijing, so from London to mainland China. But on the way, we're going to meet Daniel Grignon and his son Thomas. Daniel arriving from Poitou as a refugee in 1688. His son Thomas, born in London in 1703. Daniel and Thomas, as their trade card from the British Museum on the left, on your right, demonstrates, became finishers to the celebrated London goldsmith, London clockmaker, Daniel Quare, who was based in Change Alley in the City of London, and died in 1724. By the 1730s, the Grignons had established their own premises, as the trade card tells us, at the King's Arms and Dial in Russell Street, Covent Garden, where they made and sold watches and clocks, but also sold all sorts of curious toys, that's to say, adult accessories, not the 18th century equivalent of Lego. Thomas's younger brother, Charles, studied with Thomas Gainsborough at Hubert Gravelow's drawing school in Covent Garden. And I show you on the left here Charles's study of his brother Thomas, and tantalisingly, the inscription on the back indicates that Thomas had just returned from Paris at the age of 24 in 1737, demonstrating that it was indeed possible for Huguenots to return to France, and in fact recent research has demonstrated that there were as many as 6,000 Protestants in Paris by 1700. Basically, the French metropolis could not survive without the skills of this talented Protestant minority. A useful source for information about the transfers of skills is Mr. Campbell's publication, The London Tradesman, which appeared in 1747. It's a manual of trades calculated for the information of parents and the instruction of youth in their choice of business. Campbell lists 6 categories of specialisation under the heading watchmaker, with the apprenticeship fees of £10 to £30 for the main trade, £5 to £10 for the movement maker, spring maker, chain maker, case cap maker, and the finisher, what Daniel and Thomas excelled in. Campbell explains that the watchmaker's business is but of modern invention and of late improved in England to the highest perfection. We beat all Europe in clocks and watches of all sorts and export those useful engines to all parts of the known world. Of late years, the watchmaker scarce makes anything belonging to a watch. He only employs the different tradesmen amongst whom the art is divided, and puts the several pieces of the movement tighter, and adjusts and finishes it. Watches about 60 years ago went upon catgut instead of a chain, and were affected by every change of weather. It was morally impossible to adjust them to any fixed certainty. But since the invention of the chain and our improvement in the temper of springs, our watches are reduced to certain principles upon which the weather, at least in our climate, can have no effect. We all know how useful that would be. The next improvement watches and clocks received was the invention of engines for cutting the teeth in the several parts of the movement, which were formerly cut by hand. This has reduced the expense of workmanship and time to a trifle in comparison to what it was before, and brought the work to such an exactness that no hand can imitate it. The movement maker forges his wheels of brass to the just dimensions, sends them to the cutter, and has them cut at a trifling expense. He has nothing to do when he takes them from the cutter but to finish them and turn the corners of the teeth. The pinions made of steel are drawn at the mill, so the watchmaker has only to file down the pivots and fix them to their proper wheels. The springs are made by a tradesman who does nothing else, and the chain by another. These last are frequently made by women in the country about London and sold to the watchmaker by the dozen for a very small price. It requires no great ingenuity to learn to make watch chains. The instruments made for that use renders the work quite easy, which to the eye would appear very difficult. There are workmen who make nothing else but the caps and studs for watches, and silversmiths who only make cases, and workmen who cut the dial plates or enamel them, which is of late become much the fashion. When the watchmaker has got home all the movements of the watch and the other different parts of which it consists, he gives the whole to a finisher, welcome Daniel and Thomas Grignon, who put the whole machine together, having first had the brass wheels gilded by the gilder and adjusted to the proper time. The watchmaker puts his name upon the plate and is esteemed the maker, though he has not made in his shop the smallest wheel belonging to it. It is supposed, however, that he can make all the movements, and apprentices are learned still to cut them by hand. He must be a judge of the goodness of the work at first sight, and put his name to nothing but what will stand the severest trial, for the price of a watch depends upon the reputation of the maker only. So all the branches of watchmaking require a mechanic head, a light, nice hand to touch those delicate instruments with which they make pivots almost imperceptible, and a strong sight, there being scarce any trade which required a quicker eye or steadier hand. The profit of the master is considerable, and a journeyman has as much as he can earn, for they are generally paid by the piece. A finisher may earn 30 or 40 shillings a week, if constantly employed. It requires no great strength nor much education to make a practical watchmaker, but a man who intends to be master of the theory ought to have a tolerable education and should have some smattering of mechanics and mathematics. He may be bound about 14, or sooner, if he is tolerably acute. The trade is not much overstocked in town, and no trade has better encouragement in our plantations or in any other part of Europe. If he understands his business, he may have bread almost anywhere. So the Huguenot contribution to the goldsmith's trade and to silk weaving and designing is well known, but I would say their contribution to clock and watchmaking is still under-researched, and this is a very important area for focus. In contrast, back to the goldsmiths, by 1682, David Mitchell confirms that there were two French goldsmiths. First, Louis Berchier from Paris, who was a jeweller and diamond merchant, who joined the Goldsmiths Company that year and agreed to give a customary piece of plate to the company. Mr. Maubert, who agreed to be the surety for Louis Berchier, may be identified with our friend the jeweller Nicholas Maubert. In November 1682, Henry Compton, Bishop of London, great friend of the Huguenots, proposed that Jean-Louis, brother-in-law of Louis Berchier, be made free of the Goldsmiths' Company by redemption. This was only agreed after Compton was made to promise not to press his case in the cause of an alien goldsmith again. Perhaps the most celebrated of the Huguenot goldsmiths to join the Goldsmiths' Company is Pierre Harache. His certificate was signed by ministers and elders of the French churches at the Threadneedle Street and the Savoy Church, so he belonged to both the conformist congregation at the Savoy and had friends in the non-conformist congregation that met at Threadneedle Street. And before we look at Pierre Harache's work, I just wanted to share with you this contemporary, well-known engraving of the flight of the Huguenots, and this perhaps less well-known and very moving print of the great Huguenot temple outside Paris at Charenton, which was demolished within 3 days of the signing of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Originally designed by the Protestant architect Salomon de Brosse, beneath the view of the temple is one of the Psalms, translated into verse by Clement Marot and Theodore de Bèze. And it was known that when the Huguenots travelled out of the city of Paris to Charenton on a Sunday, they would chant these psalms in verse from the ox carts as they travelled en route, inevitably annoying the Catholic population. So, Pierre Harache. These are to satisfy all whom it may concern that Peter Harache, lately come from France, for to avoid persecution and live quietly, is not only a Protestant, but by His Majesty's bounty is made a free denizen, that he may settle here freely with his family. In token whereof we've given this certificate, the 28th of June, 1682. So fast forward by 1697, Harash was well established in London as this remarkable silver-gilt ewer and basin, shortly to be seen again in the British Museum, which is part of the Wilding bequest, and exquisitely finished and engraved with the coat of arms of the patron. Probably the work of Blaise Gentot, a French engraver, Catholic, who returned to his hometown of Lyon about 1700. But notice particularly the very careful silhouette of the basin, which was intended for display on the buffet, and the sculptural qualities of that helmet-shaped ewer, a form that is particularly associated with ceramics, and in particular a form produced in Rouen, in Faience, and Pierre Harash originated from Rouen. So from 1681, when the numbers of refugees from France increased markedly, the Goldsmiths Company was forced unwillingly to modify its position and admit a number of Huguenot goldsmiths by redemption. David Mitchell calculates that 11 such were admitted between 1682 and 1699. Each of these goldsmiths took several apprentices from Huguenot families. So by 1714, the beginning of George I's reign, there was a group of more than 30 Huguenot goldsmiths free of the Goldsmiths Company. Their work is particularly associated with the use of sculptural ornament, which transforms the status of secular silver. Mr. Campbell wrote of the goldsmiths and his dependents, as the workers in metal, especially of the finer metals, form sensible figures, either by casting them in moulds or forming them with the hammer, they may be reckoned of some kindred to sculpture and statuary. The goldsmith, as some call him, silversmith, is employed in making all manner of utensils in those rich metals, either for ornament or for use. His work is performed either in the mould or beat into figure by the hammer or other engine. And this is an invitation to an annual sermon and feast at Goldsmiths Hall, showing a goldsmith's workshop. And if you look at the list of stewards over on the left, you'll see bottom left the name Louis Metier, who is one of these first generation Huguenot goldsmiths. All works that have any sort of sculpture, that is, raised figures of any sort, are cast in moulds and afterwards polished and finished. Plates or dishes of silver are beat out from thin, flat plates. Tankards and other vessels of that kind are formed of thin plates soldered together, and their mouldings are beat, not cast. Their business required much more time and labour formerly than at present. Here we are in 1747. They were obliged to beat their metal from the ingot into what thinness they wanted. But now there are invented flatting mills, which reduce their metal to what thinness they require at a very small expense. The goldsmith makes all his own moulds, and for that reason ought to be a good designer and have a good taste in sculpture. He must be conversant in alchemy, that is, in all the properties of metals. He must know the proper menstruums for their solution, the various methods of extracting and refining them from their dross and impurity, the secret of mixing them with their proper alloy. He must know the various ways of assaying metals and distinguishing the real from the fictitious. From hence, it must be conjectured that he ought to be possessed of a solid judgment as well as a mechanical hand and head. His education, with respect to his business, does not require to be very liberal. A plain English education will suffice. Designing is the chief part of his early study, previous to his apprenticeship, but as his employment is the most genteel of any in the mechanic way, and that it requires a large stock to set him up, I should advise a youth for this business to have such an education as he describes in great detail elsewhere. The goldsmith employs several distinct workmen, as you can see in this 1707 print, almost as many as there are different articles in his shop. For in this great city there are hands that excel in every branch, and are constantly employed, but in that one of which they are masters. This gives us an advantage over many foreign nations in this article, as they are obliged to employ the same hands in every branch of the trade, and it is impossible to expect that a man employed in such an infinite variety can finish his work to any perfection, at least not so much as he who is constantly employed in one thing. That's a strong argument for specialisation. So I've already mentioned Simon Pantin, but we'll look first of all at some black and white images of the wonderful helmet-shaped ewer, which was made for the first Duke of Devonshire in 1697, part of the Wilding bequest at the British Museum. And you can see, absolutely illustrating Campbell's instructions, this very wonderful use of sculptural ornament, this female herm that forms the handle. And characteristic of, but not unique to, of Huguenot work is the use of the cut card, cut sheet silver, forming almost a solid lace, which is then soldered to the calyx of the ewer. And one of the criticisms of the native goldsmiths against the Huguenot and alien craftsmen was that they were artificially increasing the weight of their silver by using quantities of solder. Simon Pantin, like Pierre Harache, to whom he was apprenticed, came from Rouen, and as we've heard, was from a family established in London by the mid-17th century. He registered his first mark at Goldsmith Hall in 1701, and he worked in St Martin's Lane in the West End until 1717, when he moved nearby to Castle Street, near Leicester Fields. There was actually a Huguenot chapel in Castle Street. And he took his son, also named Simon, as apprentice. And Simon the younger was succeeded in turn by his son Louis, and Louis in turn by another Louis, as already mentioned. Louis Cuny made the communion plate for an extended Huguenot chapel at the Savoy in 1717 to 18. And his name actually appears in a denization list of 20 years earlier, on the same day, the 8th of May, 1697, as fellow Huguenot goldsmiths Pierre Platel and John Chartier. Louis Cuny became free by redemption of the company and was working at an address in Panton Street at the sign of the Three Crowns at the corner of Hedge Lane. I don't believe that his place of origin in France is recorded, but I would be delighted to hear if anybody can answer that query. He was elected to the livery of the Goldsmiths Company in 1708. His son Samuel was apprenticed to him in November 1710, but turned over to Daniel Shaw Lorimer. Samuel became free of the Goldsmiths Company, but never entered a mark. The Gentleman's Magazine reports Louis Cuny's death in December 1733. So much of the silver used by the Huguenot chapels and churches in London was supplied by Huguenot goldsmiths, as you might expect. But some of the leading Huguenot goldsmiths also created sacred silver for private patrons. Just to remind you of the almost secular form, the way communion was administered within the French churches in exile, with the ladies seated round the table and the communion cup and paten being passed along the minister in the middle. The wonderful Bernard Picard's religious ceremonies of the world, which is such a mine of information for different faiths. But here is an example of Isaac Liger, a goldsmith from Saumur, in regional France, creating a set of altar plate for the leading patron of Huguenot silver, the second Earl of Warrington, George Booth, whose great collection can be seen today in the National Trust, Dunham Massey in Cheshire. And this is rather a wonderful combination of a Spitalfields silk backcloth embroidered with a sacred monogram, the detail in the centre, and a dish which is really a substitute for an altarpiece, which is engraved after a Nibali Karachi with the Lamentation. And notice the way, as we saw before in the silver for the Savoy chapel, the secular form of the communion cup and supporting ewer pattern in salva. And I also show on the right a beautifully embroidered Bible binding, which is probably the work of Stephen Toulouse, a Huguenot embroiderer whose name recurs in the Lord Chamberlain's accounts. And such embroidered Bibles would be sent out to the colonies with gifts of sacred silver. So I suggest that maybe Stephen Toulouse was responsible for embroidering the sacred monogram on the altar backcloth at Dunham Massey. So a detail of this beautifully rendered engraving, which is the work of Simon Gribelin, an early arrival who became a member of the Clockmakers' Company in the 1680s, from a distinguished family of clock and watchmakers in Blois. He published a number of books of ornament. The first appeared in 1682. And interestingly, in 1691, he married Marie Metier, daughter of the minister Samuel Metier of the Huguenot Nonconformist Church of La Patente in Spitalfields. So this is an example of the links between the Huguenot community in Spitalfields and the Huguenot community of luxury craftsmen working in the West End. So by marrying into the Metier family, Gribelin became the brother-in-law of two other Huguenot first-generation goldsmiths, Louis Metier, whose name we saw on that Goldsmiths Company invitation, and one of the best well-known, David Veal, we'll come to shortly, who came from Metz. An amazingly great pride in their achievement as craftsmen, Simon Gribelin created not one, but two albums of his work, in which he pasted pulls from the engraving on the silver that he worked on. So there is the dish from the altar at Dunham Massey, and here is the pull, actually taken by inking that dish before he handed it over to the patron. And he carefully pasted examples of his work in a rather beautifully bound scrapbook, which you can admire in the British Museum. And there was another smaller scrapbook compiled by Simon Gribelin, which belonged to Horace Walpole and was in the library at Strawberry Hill. Well, fast forward to the 1830s, but I was particularly thrilled to find this watercolour by J.T. Smith in the collections at Yale, which shows Hogarth as Apprentice engraving his master's shop bill at the sign of the Angel. I think you can see that in the background, pinned up on the wall, presumably the master sketch from which he was working. And you can just imagine the scene of a younger apprentice, perhaps first year, bringing in more silver for the unwilling Hogarth to engrave with armorials. And that he did. We know that the very skilled engraving in the centre of the seal salver made for Sir Robert Walpole after the death of George I, when the original seal as Chancellor of the Exchequer was out of date, was engraved by Hogarth with this wonderful scene of a representation of that seal of office being held aloft by Hercules within the background, the City of London, which of course was the source of Walpole's wealth, passed on to the next generation as well. Pierre Platel a pilgrim bottle, another splendid display piece from the V&A collections, made for General Charles Churchill, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough's younger brother. Pierre arrived in England in 1688 with his brother Claude in the train of William III. Received denization shortly afterwards, free by redemption by order of the Court of Aldermen in 1699. He entered his mark as a large worker that year with an address in Pall Mall, over against the Duke of Schomberg's. He was still in Pall Mall 10 years later. He was eventually buried in St James's, Piccadilly. Interestingly, Platel's best known today as being the master of Paul de Lamry, and his son of the same name, Peter, was elevated in terms of education, studied at Queen's College, Cambridge, and became a vicar in Essex, Yeldham Magna, and eventually in Newport, who died there in 1769. Interestingly, when Paul de Lamry was taken on as apprentice by Platel, a special fee of £6 was enabled by charity given to Paul de Lamry's father, a retired soldier in William III's army, a grant from the royal bounty that resulted in a house-to-house collection across the nation for the benefit of French refugees. And there again is a pull from the Wall-Pearl salver, actually rather easier to read the quality of the engraving preserved in the British Museum. Daniel Garnier, particularly interesting, perhaps one of the most talented of the first generation Huguenot goldsmiths. He was the son of Isaac Garnier, apothecary at the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, became free of the goldsmiths' country in 1696 by redemption according to an order of the Lord Mayor and Court of Aldermen. So he had to pay 46 shillings and sixpence to the city for the privilege and £10 to the goldsmiths' company. Again, his address was in Pall Mall, suitably close to the royal court. But he had been working in London probably since his arrival in 1684. There's an earlier sterling mark, but you can see his Britannia mark in the inset above, which comes from the Goldsmiths Company registers. Very often, the marks of the Huguenot goldsmiths have something indicating their French origin. So I think here you can just make out the crowned fleur-de-lis. Daniel Garnier's family came from Vitry-le-François in Champagne. He took one of his fellow Huguenots, James Bechefer, as an apprentice in 1697, the year in which he registered his mark. But Bechefer left the craft for the army in 1714. And this is a spectacular silver-gilt tankard marked by Garnier, 1698-9, the year, in fact, of his death, which formed part of the collection of the great financier Sir Ernest Cassel and was acquired as part of a consortium bid of silver from Cassell's collection, 11 objects that went to 9 different museums. This example is in the National Museum of Wales. This, unfortunately, is one that got away. It's a silver chandelier, part of a royal commission for Hampton Court Palace, the reign of William III. And in fact, if you visit Hampton Court today, you can see Daniel Garnier's masterpiece, a wonderful toilet service with chaste sculptural insets, which we're hoping to have a closer look at later this year. Well, I mentioned the name of David Guillaume, and I think he's perhaps the most significant of the craftsmen I'm going to discuss who specialise in silver, partly also because he offered banking facilities which helped the profit margin. He was the son of Adam Guillaume from Metz, and by 1687 was working at the sign of the Windsor Castle at Charing Cross. He was married at the French chapel of La Patente in Spitalfields to Mary, the daughter of Samuel Metier, the minister of that church, and the sister of Louis Metier, goldsmith. Free, 1693, livery, 5 years later, 1698, member of the Court of Assistants by 1724. in St James's Street by 1719. He assisted at the marriage of his sister-in-law Mary to Simon Gridelin in 1691. But from the profits of his work both as a goldsmith and as a banker, he was able to retire in 1728, and he purchased the manor of Tingryth in Bedfordshire, close to the estates of one of his leading patrons, the Duke of Bedford. David Guillaume the Younger was apprenticed to his father in 1707. Interestingly, while still an apprentice, he was sent by his father to Metz to claim an inheritance. He became free of the Goldsmith Company in 1723. Interestingly, his second marriage was to Elizabeth, daughter of Charles Dimmock of Ampthill in Bedfordshire. David Guillaume the Younger became High Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1737. So it's a textbook case of progress from refugee to landed establishment. And I suspect that the Guillaume family were of gentry status in Metz. Well, Louis Mété, you've already met, was apprenticed to David Guillaume the Elder in 1693, free by 1700, premises in Pall Mall, and he married Anne Hobbema, described as a widow who was living with Pierre Harache in Suffolk Street. And his son, Samuel Mété, was free of the goldsmiths by patrimony in 1741. Well, a fine example of a wine fountain, one of a pair by Guillaume, made for the first Duke of Montagu, inspired by designs published by Daniel Marrow, as you see here. And a set of dishes by Louis Mété, made for the Royal Jewel House with the crown and royal arms initials for Queen Anne, part of the Wilding bequest, coming on display at the British Museum in April. But one speciality was to provide false teeth as well as making silver. The Pilot family came from Le Mans. Pezé Pilot was established in St Martin's Lane in the West End when the newspaper The Postman announced in 1696, Mr. Pilot, a French goldsmith, does give notice that by an experience of 18 years, he has found out a way to make and set artificial teeth in so firm a manner that one may chew with them. He was succeeded by his son of the same name, who was apprenticed to fellow Huguenot goldsmith John Chartier in 1710. By 1719, Pezé Pilot Jr. had set up shop next to Slaughter's Coffee House in St Martin's Lane, and in the same year he moved to the sign of the Golden Cup in Chandos Street, as you've seen on his trade card, and I thought you might like to see some dentures of hippopotamus and walrus ivory from the British Dental Association Museum in London. I assume they were providing ivory teeth in no ways discernible from natural ones. John Chartier was the son of Jean Chartier of Blois. He joined the Savoy Church in 1688, free of the Goldsmiths' Company 10 years later. He married Suzanne Garnier, and their son was baptized at the Leicester Fields Church in 1697. John Chartier's son, Daniel, apprenticed to him in 1720. His daughter, Henriette, was married on Christmas Day, 1724, to Pezé Pilot, his former apprentice. And John Chartier sends godfather to one of Henriette and Pezé's children, Jean Pezé, in 1729, and another one, Alexis, in 1731. These remarkable gold chocolate cups were made out of recycled memorial rings in 1700 for another Huguenot patron, Anne Houblon, a member of that remarkable dynasty of financiers who were responsible for the initiation and founding of the Bank of England. And these cups again came through at the same time as the Castle silver and can be seen in the British Museum, where Judy Rudeau has wonderfully shown alongside them a little pile of 20 memorial rings showing how many rings it would take to get the weight of these little cups with which Lord and Lady Palmerston, would drink to the memory of members of the Huguenot family with the traditional little inscriptions on memorial rings ascribed to the base and handles of these delicate cups. Well, I could probably go on talking for several hours, but I thought I would just give you a taste of some of the other areas in which Huguenot craftsmen excelled. Royal cabinet maker Cornelius Gaule was the son of Pierre Gaule, Louis XIV's cabinet maker. And here is an example of a wonderful cabinet in the V&A on the left, and of marquetry furniture attributed to Cornelius Gaule at Boughton House, originally made for Ralph Montague, Charles II's ambassador to the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. Or the extraordinary workshop run by the Pelletier family from Paris, Jean and Esther Pelletier, and their two sons, Thomas and René. They supplied giltwood furniture to furnish Montague House, Bloomsbury, Ralph Montague's London house, and a suite of furniture for William III's state apartments at Hampton Court. And they also supplied many picture frames following designs of Daniel Marrow. And here on the right is an original frame with corners and middles based on Marrow's designs, surrounding a portrait of Hortense Mancini, Duchess of Mazarin, a particularly close friend of Ralph Montague. And I touched briefly on Olivia's territory, the extraordinary designer James Lemon, both a designer and a master weaver, and pay tribute to my colleague Claire Brown's genius in identifying this extraordinary portrait given to the V&A by the visionary Paul Minette of direct Huguenot descent, because it represented a Huguenot silk merchant, and brilliantly identified by Claire. And I juxtapose this with a wonderful example of Lemon's work on the right. And look at it's known as a sort of bizarre style, this amazing use of very bright colours, and share with you the rather exciting discovery of James Lemon's presence in the pews at the Threadneedle Street Church in approximately 1737. As with the Pantins, the Lemon family are thought to have been established in Canterbury before progressing to Spitalfields. They were living in Stewart Street in the old artillery ground. Interestingly, James married in about 1718 an English girl, Sarah Fuller, and James took over his father's business after his father's death in about 1724. He progressed through the Weavers' Company, was elected to the Court of Assistants, and renter bailiff in 1731. When he died in 1745, his will reveals his wide-ranging interests. My paintings, drawings, and all my collection of my prints, my reading books, my music and picture books, and my collections of copybooks, my musical and mathematical instruments of all sorts, my collections of medals and coins. His three surviving sons were apprenticed in turn: James from 1735 to 42, David from 1742, and Samuel after his father's death in 1749. So we have a remarkable collection of designs by James Lemon which are being conserved at the moment. Olivia and I are very excited that BBC have decided to devote a half-hour film to the subject of the Huguenot Spitalfields silk weavers, focusing particularly on the treasures associated with Lemon's design and production. So watch that space. It's all part of the Civilization series, which I'm sure you're all very aware of. So apart from the Villon, Metier and Riblin families, who linked the luxury trades of the West End with those of the East, there are many further connections between those two communities, not least through the presence of the Huguenot church at Threadneedle Street, which is like an anchor in the centre. And one of the most remarkable dynasties to develop both strands is, of course, that of the Courtauld family, originally refugees from Saint-Pierre-d'Oléron near La Rochelle, Augustin Courtauld, goldsmith, whose portrait I show you here, joined his father, a wine cooper in London, in 1696 and was apprenticed to Simon Pantin. Became free in 1708 and married the following year, produced 8 children. They were all baptised actually at the Orange Street Chapel. There's still a chapel on the site behind the National Gallery. His workshop was established in St Martin's Lane, and he moved to a house at the corner of Chandler Street and St Martin's Lane, which is featured in Hogarth's print, The Enraged Musician. Augustin's son Samuel, born in 1720, was apprenticed to his father in 1734. His fellow apprentices were all from Huguenot families. Samuel was well placed to take advantage of the opportunity to draw from the living model nearby at the St Martin's Lane Academy, founded by fellow Huguenot Louis Chéron in 1720. That's actually Horace Walpole's hand, master of Van der Gucht, but not in England. Van der Gucht was another engraver, and Aubert appears to be a rather important engraver, probably of Huguenot origin, who produced some spectacular engravings of Blenheim Palace, I discovered earlier this week. Augustin Courtauld's premises were close to the goldsmith and jeweller Peter Duten's, trade card on the screen, who in 1736 supplied this sophisticated clock for Frederick, Prince of Wales, possibly as a wedding present for his royal bride, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. This clock has recently been acquired by the V&A. In 1747, David Hubert, a Huguenot watch and clockmaker, established the Westminster French Charity School in the Strand. His portrait, shown here, is preserved in the French Hospital collection, and this subscription sheet is in the British Museum. By the 1750s, the second generation of Huguenot craftsmen were well established. Here in the centre is the trade card for Thomas Harache. His younger brother Francis was a specialist snuff box maker, example on the screen, and they supplied luxury goods via a shop on the north side of Pall Mall from 1751. They were nephews of Pierre Harache, who registered his mark at Goldsmiths Hall in 1686. And in the Huguenot Museum in Rochester is this beautiful gold chatelaine lent from a private collection. From 1741, Samuel Courtauld worked for his father as a journeyman, and he registered his first own mark in 1746. I love the juxtaposition of his sign at the Rising Sun in Chandler Street with this extraordinary toilet basin on loan from a private collection, which is unmarked. But I think Samuel Courtauld's trade card demonstrates how the Huguenot craftsmen have mastered the subtlety of chaste surfaces. But Samuel moved to the city, having married Louisa Plamina Auger, daughter and sister of silk weavers, at St Luke's Church in Finsbury. So he moved in 1751 to the sign of the Crown at 21 Cornhill, facing the Royal Exchange in the City of London, and in 1764 he became an elder of the Threadneedle Church, as you can see from the document on the screen. His wife, Louisa, shown here, was born in Poitou. Her father, Peter Auger, was a silk weaver in Spitalfields with a house in Spital Square. Louisa was widowed in 1765 at the age of 37. She carried on the business after her husband's death, although we think the portrait may date from before her husband's death. She then registered her own mark, and in 1768 a joint mark with her husband's former apprentice, George Cowles. George Cowles married her niece, Judith, daughter of Samuel's sister, Anne, and her husband, John Jacob, who was also a talented working silversmith. And recently, portraits of John and Anne Jacob have surfaced, painted in the 1770s. They've been acquired by the Huguenot Museum in Rochester and will hopefully be displayed soon after cleaning. So, example of silver by John Jacob and by Louisa Courtauld, jointly with George Giles, in the neoclassical style, engraved with neoclassical designs after Sir William Hamilton's collection of Greek vases, published by Arconville in 1767. But I wanted to end with one of the most colourful kinds of an apprenticeship within the Huguenot goldsmith's workshop. Young Abraham Portal was apprenticed to Paul de Lamary in 1740. He was the son of a Huguenot vicar with a living in the Church of England. Abraham Portal was born in Derbyshire. But his brother Andrew was in Geneva, and Abraham's letters to Andrew survive, and they provide insight into the mind of an unwilling apprentice. Although a talented craftsman, as silver bearing his maker's mark demonstrates, Abraham's heart was in literature, and he eventually earned an entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography through his work as a playwright. His play, Olinda and Sophronia, was based on the Italian classic by Torquato Tasso, Jerusalem Liberata, performed in London in 1758. It's prefaced by an explanation that Abraham was, I quote, educated and hitherto passed his time, not in the learned and peaceful retreats of the Muses, but in the rude and noisy shop of Vulcan. His performance is but the effort of almost unassisted nature, the solace and amusement of his leisure hours. In his youth, Abraham sent his brother a verse describing his role as an apprentice. What sacred muse will now my thoughts inspire, or deign to touch with poetic fire? Should I, sweet Calliope, invoke thy aid? Our noisy tools would fright the tender maid. Do thou, great Clio, then our toil rehearse, soften our noisy art in gentle verse. 6 in the morning from the bed we rise, and rub the sleepy humour from our eyes. Anyway, he did produce some fine silver, and the communion plate for the chapel for the Asylum of Female Orphans can be seen in the Sacred Silver Galleries at the V&A. The tenacity of the dynasties of craftsmen and women that I've introduced this evening may be explained by the longevity of their commitment to their respective skills. Their faith excluded them from certain professions in France. The skills acquired in certain crafts lent social status. The goldsmith's trade, as we see, could be combined with banking. It's significant that there are several examples of successive generations achieving education at Oxford and Cambridge and taking ordination as Anglican clergy. Behind this engagement with education and a desire to share such knowledge lay an intellectual curiosity as craftsmen, developing scientific hobbies which informed their awareness of the natural world and their design skills. Judging from surviving examples of book plates, Paul de Lamry's is preserved in the Royal Library, Peter Romilly, a jeweller of Frith Street, Soho, and father, Solicitor General Sir Samuel Romilly, is preserved in the French Hospital collection. Many of these talented Huguenot Londoners had private libraries, or the use of that acquired by the Threadneedle Street Huguenot Church from a member of the Bosanquet family. An exciting new project to publish Huguenot family bookplates and establish the publications to which the Huguenots subscribed promised to throw further exciting light on this extraordinary exodus from France that contributed so much to the achievements of the luxury trades in London from the mid-16th to the mid-18th centuries. Thank you for your attention.